After 60, something silent is happening inside your body right now. And the scariest part is you won't feel a thing until it's too late. No pain, no warning, no symptoms. Just one day, a fall, a fracture, and a diagnosis that changes everything. Doctors have tracked this for years, and the numbers are alarming. Bone density can quietly vanish at a rate of 1% every single year after menopause, with nearly a third of postmenopausal women eventually developing full-blown osteoporosis. But here's what nobody is telling you. The real damage isn't coming from where you think. The 5 mistakes destroying your bones after 60 are not the obvious ones. 2 of them are daily habits so common, so normal, that you have almost certainly done at least one of them already today. And 3 of them are foods, including one that is actively marketed as a health food, one that millions of seniors eat every single morning believing it's good for them. Spoiler, it isn't. Not for your bones. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which 5 things are silently working against your skeleton right now, and the simple, specific swap for every single one of them. But the food that shocked us most? We're saving that for last, because once you hear it, you will never look at your breakfast the same way again. Setting the stakes. The part that surprises people is this. Bone loss after 60 rarely comes from one big dramatic decision. It comes from small, ordinary choices repeated day after day. The kind that never get flagged as a problem because they feel completely normal. Once you understand that, the whole picture changes, because the fixes turn out to be just as small and just as ordinary. At least 40% of women who develop osteoporosis will go on to have a fragility fracture, a break that happens from something as minor as a fall from standing height or even a hard sneeze, is what determines whether you end up with a net gain or a net loss of bone over the years. Age also works against you here in a quieter way. Net calcium absorption sits at around 25% for most adults and keeps declining as you get older, which means the same diet that supported strong bones at 40 absorbs less efficiently at 65 or 70. This is exactly why doctors can measure your cumulative calcium status with a simple bone density scan, because the skeleton keeps a running record of decades of these small daily gains and losses added together. Almost nobody explains this part clearly. Calcium loss comes down to how much of it your body actually keeps, not just how much you eat. That depends on absorption, on what pulls calcium back out through the kidneys, and on what your bones are asked to do on a daily basis. That single idea, keeping calcium versus losing it, ties together everything in this video, starting with the first mistake, which has nothing to do with food at all. Mistake number 5. Not getting enough vitamin D. The 5th mistake isn't eating too little calcium. It isn't being able to use the calcium you already eat, and that comes down to one vitamin working in the background. Vitamin D is required for your gut to actively absorb calcium from food and get it into your bloodstream. Without enough of it, a real portion of the calcium in your diet just passes through the body unused, no matter how much dairy, leafy greens, or fortified food you eat. You can be doing everything right on paper and still come up short, because the door calcium needs to walk through simply isn't open. There are actually 2 ways your gut pulls calcium out of food. One is active transport, which depends heavily on vitamin D, and does most of the work when your calcium intake is on the lower side. The other is passive diffusion, which doesn't need vitamin D and takes over more as your intake rises. That means if your diet is already modest in calcium, which describes a lot of people simply eating normal portions, the vitamin D-dependent pathway is doing most of the heavy lifting. When vitamin D status is low, researchers consistently find it reduces calcium absorption more than almost any other single dietary factor. more than caffeine, more than sodium, more than the oxalates we will get to later in this video. This is why so many people find that their calcium intake doesn't seem to translate into stronger bones. The fix here is genuinely low effort. A little regular sunlight, vitamin D-rich foods like fatty fish and egg yolks, or a supplement discussed with your doctor can close that gap. None of these require a diet overhaul, just a small, consistent habit that makes every other change in this video actually count, because none of the food swaps coming up will matter much if the vitamin D door stays shut. Skin also naturally makes less vitamin D from sunlight as you get older, so a habit that worked fine at 40 may stop covering the gap by the time you're past 60. That's worth mentioning to your doctor at a regular checkup, rather than assuming your levels are still where they used to be. Once your body can use the calcium coming in, the next question becomes whether your bones have a reason to hold on to it. Which brings us to mistake number 4. Mistake number 4. Skipping weight-bearing movement. Bone is living tissue, and it responds to the load you put on it. When you regularly ask your bones to bear weight through walking, climbing stairs, or light resistance work, your body reads that as a signal to maintain density. When months go by without that signal, your body has less incentive to keep the bone it already has. Remember that remodeling process we talked about, where bone is constantly broken down and rebuilt. Weight-bearing movement is one of the main signals that tips that balance toward rebuilding instead of breaking down. Skip the movement for long enough, and the balance tips the other way. Not because anything went wrong, just because the signal your skeleton relies on stopped showing up. This is a mistake of omission more than anything dramatic. Nobody sits down and decides to stop moving. It happens gradually. A shorter walk here, a skipped flight of stairs there, until the cumulative signal your bones are getting has quietly dropped off. The fix doesn't require a gym membership or a training plan. A daily walk, taking stairs when you can, and a few minutes of light resistance work most days is enough to keep sending your skeleton the message that it still needs to hold its ground. Balance-focused movement matters here too, since a big share of fractures start with a fall rather than the bone simply giving out on its own. And staying steady on your feet is its own form of bone protection. So that covers the 2 habits almost nobody thinks to question. Now for the part the title promised, because 2 habits alone don't explain everything. Some of it really is sitting on your plate, and the first food on this list is one almost everyone has in the kitchen right now. Mistake number 3. High-sodium processed foods. The third mistake is reaching for high-sodium processed foods, canned soups, deli meats, and salty packaged snacks, without realizing there's a direct line between that salt shaker and your skeleton. The mechanism works like this. The more sodium you eat, the more calcium your kidneys dump out through urine. If blood calcium runs short as a result, your body pulls the difference from your bones to keep your blood levels stable, since blood calcium is tightly regulated no matter what it costs your skeleton. A long-term study following postmenopausal women found that hip bone density loss over 2 years was directly tied to how much sodium showed up in their urine. That connection was just as strong as the link between bone loss and how much calcium the women were eating in the first place. Research on reducing salt intake has found it can create what is called a positive calcium balance, meaning the body actually starts holding on to more calcium than it loses. That suggests cutting back on salt can help slow the natural calcium drain that comes with aging. The numbers make this easier to picture. An average person in the U.S. eats about 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day, which works out to roughly 1.5 teaspoons of salt, well above the recommended ceiling of 2,300 milligrams. Research shows continued benefit as intake drops closer to 1,500 milligrams. A single teaspoon of table salt alone contains close to that entire 2,300 milligram daily ceiling, which means one oversalted meal can use up your whole day's allowance before dinner even starts. And this rarely comes from the shaker on your table. Most of the sodium in a typical diet comes from processed and restaurant food, things like canned soup, cured deli meat, frozen dinners, and packaged snacks, which is exactly why this mistake is so easy to make without noticing. You can go your whole day without ever picking up a salt shaker and still land well above that ceiling. Not all salt is created equal for sure. The swap is straightforward and doesn't mean giving up flavor entirely. Choose lower sodium canned and deli options where they exist, and rinse canned beans and vegetables under water before eating them to wash away a good portion of the added salt. Check nutrition labels against that 2,300 milligram ceiling instead of guessing based on taste, since salty and high sodium are not always the same thing on a label. Herbs, citrus, and vinegar can carry a lot of the flavor that salt would otherwise provide, which means cutting sodium doesn't have to mean cutting taste problems. That makes this one change that works on two fronts at once. Sodium's damage is at least something you can track, since it shows up in plain numbers on a nutrition label. The next mistake hides inside a food a lot of people think is doing them nothing but good. Mistake number 2, relying on spinach for calcium. The second mistake is the most surprising one on this list, and it involves spinach, a food that shows up on almost every good for your bones list you will ever read. Spinach contains a compound called oxalic acid, and oxalic acid binds to calcium, forming a compound your body can't absorb. That means a meaningful share of the calcium sitting right there in your spinach never actually makes it into your bloodstream at all. Only about 5% of the calcium in spinach gets absorbed by your body, compared with 27% from a glass of milk. More than 5 times less usable calcium from a food many people assume is a calcium powerhouse. Adults generally need somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 milligrams of calcium a day, depending on age. When a big share of your plan for hitting that number rests on spinach, you're working with a much smaller real number than the label in your head suggests. And spinach isn't alone. Other foods high in oxalic acid include collard greens, sweet potatoes, rhubarb, and beans, all of which carry the same problem to varying degrees, blocking a real portion of their own calcium content from ever reaching your bones. To be clear, this isn't an argument to cut spinach out of your life. If you eat a varied diet with plenty of different vegetables, this effect mostly washes out and stops being a real concern. The issue is specifically relying on spinach as a go-to calcium source, which is exactly the habit a lot of health-conscious people fall into, especially anyone who has been told for years that leafy greens are the safe, virtuous choice. The swap here is simple once you know what to look for. Broccoli, kale, and cabbage don't contain these calcium-blocking compounds, so their calcium bioavailability is similar to milk's, even though they carry less calcium per serving than spinach does. Swapping in kale or broccoli a few times a week, especially on days when spinach would otherwise be your main green, gets you calcium your body can actually use instead of calcium that passes straight through. It also helps to lean on foods that were never relying on absorption tricks in the first place. Plain low-fat yogurt, fortified orange juice, part-skim mozzarella, canned sardines with the bones still in, and calcium-set tofu all deliver calcium your body absorbs without any of the oxalate interference spinach carries. Rotating a few of these into your week takes the pressure off any single food to do all the work. So that's 2 foods down that work against your bones without you realizing it. The last one isn't even something you'd normally think of as food. It's the drink half the country reaches for before they've even had breakfast. Mistake number 1. Too much caffeine. The first and final mistake on this list is caffeine, and this is the one with the most specific, personally useful number attached to it. A study followed 489 women between the ages of 65 and 77, with a 3-year follow-up done in a smaller group of 96 of those women. Women with caffeine intake above 300 milligrams a day lost bone at the spine noticeably faster than women with lower intake, showing roughly a 1.9% loss compared with about 1.2% in the lower intake group over the study period. In practical terms, 300 milligrams of caffeine works out to about 18 ounces of brewed coffee, so a bit more than 2 standard cups a day is the rough line where this study found the effect kicking in. That number matters because it turns a vague warning into something you can actually check against your own daily routine tonight. There's also a genetic wrinkle worth knowing about, because it explains why this hits some women harder than others. Women carrying a specific variant of the vitamin D receptor gene showed a much sharper rate of spine bone loss, around 8%, compared with roughly 0.3% in women without that variant, even at the same high caffeine intake. That means 2 women could drink the exact same amount of coffee every day and end up with very different outcomes, depending on something neither of them can control or even see. It's a reminder that these 5 mistakes don't all carry equal weight for every single person. Some people are more sensitive to caffeine's effect on bone than others, and there's no simple test at home to tell you which group you fall in. That's exactly why the fix doesn't require quitting caffeine altogether. Capping your intake at roughly 2 cups a day, or swapping one of your daily cups for decaf or tea, keeps most women comfortably under that 300 milligram threshold without giving up the ritual of a morning cup entirely. Tea generally delivers less caffeine per cup than brewed coffee, which makes it an easy half-step down rather than an all-or-nothing switch. Pairing your coffee with a calcium source at a different time of day, rather than relying on that cup to also be your calcium moment, keeps the two from working against each other. Decaf isn't entirely caffeine-free either, so if you're trying to stay well under the threshold, checking a label still matters more than assuming decaf means 0. Talk to your doctor before making any big changes to your diet, especially if you're on medication for osteoporosis, blood pressure, or kidney issues, since some of these swaps interact differently depending on your specific health history. So that's the real picture. Bone loss after 60 isn't one dramatic mistake. It's 5 quiet ones, 2 habits, and 3 foods, each with a specific mechanism and a specific fix. The next question worth asking is what actually helps your body rebuild the calcium these mistakes take away? And that's exactly what we cover next.